I'm Sara Aldridge and I'm a compliance certifier and the HAZNO team leader here at Chem Safety. Joining me on the panel today is my colleague Janet, and I'll let her introduce herself shortly. But first, I just wanted to let you know how we're going to be running this panel discussion today. So you'll see below at the bottom of your screen, if you wiggle your mouse, there's a Q&A button. So if you could upload your questions there now, that would be awesome. I would really like to make today about answering your questions rather than us just spouting on and talking to you. So we'd really like it to be as interactive as possible. And we'll answer the questions as they pop up. But first, I'll just let Janet talk briefly about the kinds of paperwork that are required for location compliance certification, and then we can get to your questions. Janet.
Excellent. Thanks, Sara. So I'm Janet Connochie. I've been with Chem Safety for over 19 years now, which is starting to feel just a bit much, but it's great fun. I'm a senior consultant, compliance certifier, and also director here, and the hazardous substances specialist. So what we're looking at focusing on in today's Q&A is around the paperwork and the documentation that's required in relation to your location compliance certification. So these are things like your inventories, your safety data sheets, the notification record that you will have from notifying WorkSafe that your location exists, your training records and certified handlers if those are required, what you need on a site plan, your emergency response plan, and testing of your emergency response plan. So those are the sorts of things that are common across all types of location certificate. And then depending on the class that you've got, you might need things like your hazardous area documentation, your electrical certification, a temperature control plan, documented procedures around equipment and PPE and operating procedures. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at today, but we'll answer pretty much any question that comes along. And if we can't, we'll make a note of that and send a response out in the follow-up email. So I've got one question that's come through already. Can you explain what a controlled zone is? So is this the area around a hazardous substance cabinet or DG store? And does it take into account the distances that might be needed from protected or public places for certain classifications? And you sometimes hear people refer to a hazardous area, and is it the same as a controlled zone? Okay, so we've got three things to talk about here. The hazardous area is something different. So the hazardous area is in relation to flammable gases and vapours, the area where there's potentially an explosive atmosphere and you need to keep ignition sources away from it. So it's quite separate from the controlled zone and the separation distance. In the old HAZNO regulations, it only talked about controlled zones. And in the newer regulations since 2017, we have separation distances from protected and public places, and then also controlled zones. For classes 2 and 3, we're talking about a separation distance from your location to protected or public places, so making sure that those are the right distance away. For classes 4 and 5, it still refers to a controlled zone. So the controlled zone is an area around your storage area that you have control over. So you need to be able to manage which people can come into that zone. And it is also, the size of that zone does depend on the public or protected places if those are nearby. So they are three different things. In relation to a cabinet or a gas store or for your toxic substances, it's a separation distance only, but for the class 4 and 5, it is a controlled zone where you actually do need to have some reasonable control over who can access that area. Make sure that people who could, who you don't have control over can't go there.
Another question that has come through. I'd particularly like to know the law or legislation that requires emergency plans to be developed. So in the hazardous substances regulations, so the health and safety at work hazardous substances regulations, emergency response is a big part of that. And to be required for location certification, you would need to exceed the thresholds. So the thresholds differ depending on what class of substance you have. And if you're below it, then to get your certificate, you wouldn't need an emergency response plan. If you exceed the threshold, then you would, and that your emergency plan and testing and submitting to FENS and all of that sort of things that go with it become a big part of your certification. It also comes in under part I want to say 18 for laboratories. I believe, Janet, correct me if I'm wrong, that you do need emergency plans if you're operating in a laboratory environment, regardless of quantity that you have.
That's right. So yes, if you are operating a laboratory under Part 18, you do have to have an emergency response plan, regardless, that's not a word, regardless of your quantity of hazardous substances. I also want to say that under the General Risk and Workplace Management Regulations, every workplace needs to have an emergency plan. But when we're talking about emergency response plans for your location certificate, that's going above and beyond that for the specific classes of substances that exceed that threshold, that we need our emergency response plan to address emergencies that could relate to those substances. You'll follow that up there, Peter, with, is it the same, is it a fire evacuation, and leave the rest up to FENS? So we do often see people who have their emergency procedures, and under fire it says that they will evacuate. But it might also say that if it's safe to do so, use a fire extinguisher. So it's about making sure that you've documented what you're going to do. So if it's in the case of a fire, if all you are going to do is evacuate and wait for FENS to turn up, then that's what your plan needs to say, and that's what you need to be testing. So your evacuation scheme and your regular drills, 6-monthly trial evacuations will cover that. But what we often see is that people have an emergency response plan that says, in the event of a fire, if it's safe to do so, use a fire extinguisher. And when they're doing their testing of their plans, all they've covered is the evacuation, which is only about getting people out of the building. It is nothing about tackling a fire if it's safe to do so. So you would need to, when you are testing your procedures, what would you do in a fire? Consider exactly what it is that you would do. And then FENS also respond to things that aren't fires. So if you're looking at what you might be doing for a spill, depending on the level, you might get FENS involvement there, and they will come to site if it's an emergency, and they will deal with it. But you will also need to have procedures in place on how you're going to get everything back and operating and ready to go and cleaned up, so that your site's back to where it needs to be. So you need to make sure that you're covering those in your procedures as well. FENS are have to have an opportunity to review your emergency response plan. So if you're needing an emergency response plan because of the quantity of hazardous substances you have on site, then when we're doing the certification, we are checking that you have submitted that to FENS to get their comment on. So they'll be looking at the bits of your emergency procedures that say call FENS, and making sure that they're happy with what you've said there. So they're not looking at the whole plan, but if you've said, in the event of anything happening on site, we're going to call FENS and not do anything ourselves, hopefully they'll give you some feedback that say, actually, we can't do that. And it's particularly important if you're in a regional area, if you're not with a dedicated paid FENS brigade, that you've got quite a good level of engagement as to what the capability of the local FENS responders are.
Another question come in to do with emergency response plan testing, and how often should it be done, and how do you recommend testing it? So if you need an emergency response plan under the HazSubs regs, you need to test it at least once every year, every 12 months, unless you make a change or there's a change in personnel, and then you need to test it within 3 months of that change. So typically every 12 months, unless you change something up. And how do we recommend doing it? I mean, you could do it as a tabletop discussion, sit down around a table with everybody and go through the plan and what you would do in each of your different scenarios. You could create a scenario, like make-believe scenario, and discuss that. You could do a walkthrough, like actually walk through what might be happening, so you can go through it step by step. And for a spill, some people use a bucket of water. Or in some cases, if you've actually had an incident like a spill or something that's actually happened, you can document that and use that as an evidence of a test as well. So yeah, lots of different ways to do it, and perhaps, change it up each time you do it. Don't do tabletop discussions every time. Throw in some scenarios, and yeah, get everyone on board.
And if you can build your emergency response plan testing into part of what you're doing as your ongoing health and safety, not my compliance certificate's due next week, I better do an ERP test. But a lot of people will look at the different aspects of their emergency response plan. And so, perhaps one quarter they'll look at fire, one quarter they might look at the spill of a corrosive substance, they might look at the particular first aid, the response that's done, so that you're looking at the different aspects of your plan over the course of the 12 months you've tested the whole thing, but you're not doing it all at once. The purpose of the plan testing is to see where the alignment is between what the plan says you'll do and what your people will do. And if there's a difference between those, is it the plan that needs changing? Is it the training that needs changing there? And one other way that we do see clients testing their procedures, particularly if they're larger sites, is sometimes they have FENS come out on site and do a visit or run a scenario as well, just depending on the nature of the substance that they have. I think the next question we've got there is around, is location compliance certificates required for diesel stored in transportable containers? So location compliance certification is not required for diesel at all. So the classification of diesel, it's not flammable enough to require a location compliance certificate. Yeah, so there are requirements around the storage of it. There are some separation distances that need to be in place, secondary containment for its particularly for its ecotoxic properties, but also because it is combustible. And if it was in tanks, then there might need to be stationary compliance certification, but there's no location compliance certificate requirement for diesel.
Cool. Next question is to do with site plans. So if we're doing a site plan of our building and where the DGs are located, does this have to include neighbouring properties bordering our building? So for the site plan, the requirements are that it does show where your legal property boundary is. The regs don't specify that you have to show things outside your boundary, so your neighbour's property. Although, I mean, if there are buildings and things like that that are quite close to your boundary and sort of encroaching on those separation distances and hazardous areas and whatnot, they sort of play a part in where your dangerous goods are located, then it'd certainly be best practice to include those details if you've got them. Particularly sometimes from like the council mapping software, you can get an aerial image and just snip it to include the relevant bits over your boundary where your neighbour's property sort of has an impact on what you're doing on your site. But technically, no, you don't need to, but I mean, definitely best practice if you can include a bit of detail of what's going on in your neighbour's property.
The next question, back to FENS. So how often does FENS review need to occur? So we would ask you to resubmit your plan to FENS if there was a significant change in the quantities or the response that's expected on site there. So if you haven't changed the quantity or the layout or any of your procedures around your emergency response plan, then I wouldn't be expecting FENS to have a look at that again. Depending on your site, you may have different degrees of engagement with the local FENS people, and so they might have some ideas as to what would be needed there, but only if there's been a significant change in the quantities, where things are, or the response that you would have.
Next question. So this person has in their store, they store various chemicals with different classes. Can we make our emergency response plan according to the class of chemicals rather than the individual chemical? So yes, you certainly can. If you can group them together, so yeah, how you would respond to a fire involving flammable liquids, a spill of flammable liquids versus like a fire involving LPG or a spill of corrosives. By all means, yeah, group your classes of chemicals together. But if you do have a substance that has, is of the same class as something else, but you would need to make a specific action or response with regard to that specific substance, that you should certainly outline with, for that specific substance or product rather than lumping that in with the general class. But in general, if your response to all of the substances that you have of a general class are the same, then by all means you can group them together.
So going back to the discussion on controlled zones, so just some clarification there, I did say there were 3 different things. So for a given store, if it's a flammable gas or a flammable liquid, you will have a hazardous area. So that's where you need to keep ignition sources away. Then, depending on what class you have, you will either need a separation distance. So for class 2, 3, 6, and 8, you will need to have a separation distance around that store. So that's separating your store from your protected or your public places. And then if it's class 4 or 5, then around your store, you would have a controlled zone. And so that's, again, a distance or a fire-rated wall that provides that boundary. And the distance will depend on the quantity and whether it's near a protected or a public place. And it's also where you need to keep people away from. So in practice, if you were looking at a plan, they are just different size bubbles on your plan. But when we're looking on the site as to how you are managing your controlled zone, as well as making sure that there aren't any protected places or ignition sources or anything too close to the store, we're also looking at how you would be controlling that zone to make sure that unauthorized people are not permitted there.
Next question. So on site plans again, does the separation distance to public and protected places need to be drawn outside the building where the location is in a building? So, I mean, basic answer is yes, but I mean, it does, the separation distance for most classes can be managed through a distance, but in some other classes it can be managed or, stopped using a fire-rated wall. So if you're just managing your separation distance through distance, and that distance extends out of the building, then yes, you would draw your separation distance going out of that building. But if your separation distance is being stopped by an appropriately fire-rated wall, then it wouldn't go through that wall, is the most basic answer I can give you. It's kind of dependent on your exact situation and case by case is what's stopping that distance.
All right, going back to our hazardous area, it is a bit of a confusing area. Under the HAZMO regulations, it talked about hazardous atmosphere zones, and the new standard or the new regulation refers to the standard that talks about a hazardous area. So a hazardous area and a hazardous atmosphere zone are the same thing. So of those 3 types of separation I was talking about, you've got your hazardous area, previously called a hazardous atmosphere zone, a controlled zone, and a separation distance. Those are the 3 things there, Gemma.
Next question, is there an LCC threshold or other requirements for storage of paints? So yes, if you've got flammable paints, then yep, they're flammable liquids, so 3.1s, and the threshold will depend on how flammable they are and the container size they're in. Most flammable paints are normally a 3.1B, some of them are 3.1Cs, but if you've got 3.1Bs and they're in containers 5 litres or less capacity, then your threshold would be 250 litres. If they're in containers bigger than 5 litres, then that threshold drops to 100 litres. If they were all 3.1Cs, which is probably less likely a situation, the smaller containers, the threshold is 1,500 litres, and the bigger containers is 500 litres. So those are the thresholds. And in terms of the requirements for it, if you exceed the LCC threshold, then all of the requirements for certification come into place, all of the paperwork requirements, emergency response, obviously depending on if you exceed that threshold, which is different again, storage in a compliant location type, management of your hazardous area and separation distance, incompatible substances, signage, fire extinguishers, all of those things come into play if you exceed those thresholds.
Just going to skip one question ahead to a question about FENS there. So the problem with FENS can be the lack of response or the time it takes for them to come back for you, and sometimes it just bounces around. For the purposes of the regulations and for getting your location compliance certificate, what we're wanting to see is that you have given FENS that opportunity to comment on it, so that you have submitted it to them, and hopefully you've got an acknowledgement that they've received it. We're not waiting on you getting a response or any feedback from them, because as you say, quite often you don't get any response from them. They do have a process for that, and if you look on their website under emergency plans, there is a centralized address where they should be sent to, and then they triage it around the various areas there. So it can be tricky and frustrating when you're waiting for a response there. If you do know someone in your local area, you can talk to them, but FENS do like them to go through that centralized process so that they're being reviewed in a consistent manner, and they don't always respond. If it's something that they're very happy to see, very straightforward, if it's an LPG installation, then they really don't need to respond to that. They're really interested in that sort of case of just making a note of what's there. If you do have particular problems with them, there's a few people at FENS that we've dealt with who have been really responsive there. So if it was a particular question, drop us a line separately.
And then going back up to Jason's question about Class 8 acids and alkalis, and do they need to be bundled separately within a warehouse, or is one bund for the complete building okay? So acids and alkalis are they're incompatible and dangerously reactive. So they would need to be in separate bunds and 5 meters apart from each other as well. That's if they're 8.2 A's and B's. So yeah, you would need 2 bunds and a separation of distance between them as well.
Okay, on ignition sources. If substances are stored in a fireproof cabinet, but electrical socket is located outside that cupboard within ½ meter, is that okay? So when you say a fireproof cabinet, I'm going to make the assumption that it's a flammable liquids cabinet that's been constructed in accordance with AS 1940, so the Australian standard on the storage of flammable liquids. And most flammable liquids cabinets that you would buy from your safety supplier would comply with that. In the hazardous, in the standard for the cabinet, it specifies the exclusion distance for ignition sources, so the hazardous area around a cabinet. And so what you're looking at there, if you're at a hazardous substance location, you need a location certificate. And I'm currently realizing that I'm overcomplicating things. But generally speaking, if you've got a flammable liquids cabinet, you need to exclude your ignition sources from 3 meters around that cabinet and to 1 meter above the top of the door as well. So within ½ meter for an electrical socket would not be acceptable around a flammable liquids cabinet.
Oh, that's all the questions we've got at the moment. So if anyone's, oh no, we've got another one. Do you not feel that last FENS? Oh, Jenna, you were talking about FENS. Yep. Do you want to answer this one? Yeah.
So do not feel that the last FENS answer is very weak, as the plan submitted could technically contain a ridiculous approach, volume or expectation on them, but you would say that it's okay. Okay, so if I'm looking at, as a compliance certifier, looking at your emergency response plan, submitting to FENS is one aspect of it, and the regulations are very clear as I go hunting for them, that in relation to FENS, and I'm just going to bring up that specific regulation. So what it says is that FENS may review an emergency response plan to assess whether the role proposed for the service is achievable and consistent with the operational policies of the service, and identify anything that may adversely affect FENS during the emergency. So that's for the FENS review. In relation to if the emergency response plan contains some sort of ridiculous approach that says, if there's a fire, we'll just let the city burn, then as part of the compliance certifier's review of your emergency response plan, we need to be checking that your plan meets the requirement of the regulations, that it says what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And we would question that ourselves as the certifier that the plan doesn't seem right. But the regulation doesn't require FENS to review the plans. It requires the PCBU to give FENS an opportunity to review the plan. So I guess that's that difference there. But yeah, if the emergency response plan said in the event of a spill, sweep it down the stormwater drain, we would question that and say that's not acceptable and you need to have a better procedure.
Another question, have we had any advice as to when a GHS threshold quantity schedule will be released? Some previous HAZNO classes are split into separate GHS classes. For example, the gases being split into category 1A and 1B. So if you're referring to when the regulations will be updated to refer to the GHS classifications and the thresholds, the regs have, I think it's 5 years to be updated. So, I mean, my guess is that it will probably take 5 years to update them. So I'd say we'll be waiting a wee bit before the regulations refer to the GHS classifications. There are on the EPA website, there are some good tables and information that sort of translate the HAZNO classes into the GHS ones, sorry. And then from there, I mean, you can look at the thresholds, as far as I'm aware, aren't going to be changing. It's just the going from HAZNO classifications to GHS ones. So you can use the tables that have been provided by the EPA to make your translation and then compare that to the regulations, which will still have thresholds. Janet, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, so you've given the example there that you've got flammable gases category 1B, and so they are equated to class 2.1.1A. So from a technical legal perspective, the mechanism of this is that the classification notice that brought in GHS states in it that any reference to a HAZNO classification will be read in accordance with the correlation schedule at the end of the classification notice. So that's that correlation table between the classes under HAZNO and the GHS classes. And we have a couple of correlation charts, one-page ones on our website as well there. So a flammable gas category 1B will have the same thresholds as a class 2.1.1A flammable gas.
Should the LCC supplier also provide a HAZNO site plan? So the duty to provide a site plan, or to provide all of the location certification paperwork and evidence, is that duty is on the PCBU. So no, the LCC supplier shouldn't or doesn't need to provide the site plan. They could offer to help you with it if you're struggling. There's also other companies out there that specialize in HAZNO site plans, or even you could use like architects and things like that, engineers, if you've got existing building plans and things like that, they can all help you to make your site plan. But no, essentially the onus is on the PCBU to provide that site plan, and it's up to you to engage whoever is going to be most helpful to you to help you with that.
Another question about electrical outlets. So if an electrical socket within 3 meters of a class 3 cabinet was disabled internally, so it couldn't be used, is it still classed as an ignition source? So as a compliance certifier, if I was looking at the situation, I would need to have evidence from the electrical worker that did that work that says it hasn't been done. I would want to see a notice or something at the minimum that says it has been properly disabled, with some details around that. Going further, replacing the outlet with a cover plate, and the next step back from that would be to actually disable or decommission the wiring to that point. So you're actually removing it entirely. So if it's not an ignition source because the wiring has been removed from behind it, then we want to see evidence of that. And if you're going to do that, then you should be removing the outlet entirely.
Another question, another FENS question. How long does it take to take FENS to approve a plan? Good question, not sure. I think it depends a lot on how much of a backlog that FENS have, and it's probably also dependent on your site and your plan as well, how straightforward or not straightforward it might be. We have never been given a straight answer, and I think it is very case dependent and how busy they are as well. I don't know if we can give you a definitive answer on that one.
Yeah, if you are thinking that it's taking much longer than you think it should do, then absolutely go back and ask them for an indication as to, are they looking at it any further? Are they intending to give you a reply or not? And ask those questions, because as I say, they don't have to look at them. They generally will acknowledge that they've received them, and if there's any problems, they'll be in contact with you. But I'm not sure how thoroughly they reply and say that's all fine, because they're not having to approve. They don't have to approve your plan. They can review it and make suggestions as to how their response will work with you, but they don't have to approve your plan. Is there a standard template for evaluating and providing the LCC information to the service provider? Short answer, no, there isn't one. When we send out our proposals for location certificates, we do include a checklist as to what we'll be looking for when we come to your site. And if you've got any suggestions as to how that checklist could be made easier for you, then that would be great. Obviously, if it's a renewal of the certificate, then you can have a look at the report that we provided last time as well. For evaluating the information, WorkSafe are in the long process of approving a performance standard for compliance certifiers. So there's been a couple that have been done around the process of issuing certificates and also for doing certified handlers. And so the performance standard is a document that compliance certifiers have to follow under the regulations of WorkSafe Approved One. And that goes into a bit of detail around what the compliance certifier has to look at in relation to the evidence that's provided. And so if you're are very interested in what's being assessed or what the certifier needs to do, when the performance standard for location certificates does eventually get approved by WorkSafe, it will be available on their website as well. And that, it provides additional mandatory things that a certifier needs to do. As an example of something that came up from a performance standard, the one in relation to certified handlers, it's the performance standard that states that we need to see a passport or birth certificate as evidence of the certified handler's name. We can't just accept a driver's license. And so it's in the performance standard, we have to do it. We questioned it when the draft came out, but WorkSafe had very clear legal advice that actually a driver's license does not necessarily have someone's legal name on it, full legal name on it. So those performance standards will give a lot of information about what we're evaluating for location certification. And okay, documented procedures for equipment, etc. So the question is, if you have an automated pump system, is the information most needed for emergencies if it fails, or just the more general process? So this is most likely coming up from the requirement under regulation 13.7. So it's around the equipment for toxic and corrosive substances has the PCBU has to ensure that the equipment is accompanied by documentation about the use and maintenance of the equipment, so that it's able to be used properly, that it's not going to go out of control. So if it's an automated pump system, the documentation that you would probably have would be the operating manual that goes with it, and any like a response chart or something. If X happens, then we need to do Y. So it is both for what to do if it fails, but also the general process. And I guess some things that you would call a failure in the system are not necessarily an emergency. So it might be something that needs your attention, that you need to deal with it, but it's part of the normal process that you respond to that initial alert, but it's not necessarily an emergency. So it's about making sure that for equipment that the operators have the documentation that's needed so that they can follow the right process. And what we find is it's a lot like training records. The people using the equipment and the substances, they know what they're doing, they know what the process is, and they were probably trained to some documentation, but there might be additional things that are particular to your site that might need to be documented as well. But short answer, general process.
That is all of the questions. So if anyone has any more, flick them through now. Otherwise, oh no, there's one. What hazardous substances management courses do we run? So essentially, we can, if there's something you would like a course on that was not sort of standard, we can put it together for you and cover the specifics of what you would like. Our sort of standard courses are the Certified Handler course and the Chemical Awareness course. And we've also got one to do with emergency response as well. And we've run some for lab managers. That's ones that sort of more standard ones. If there's extra things you would like covered, by all means get in touch with us and we can put something together for you that covers the things that you want covered, so we can tailor it to you, I guess.
We've also, over the last year or so, been running a range of webinars, and those are all available on our YouTube channel if you want to have a look at those. And you might see something there that would really work adapted for your WorkSafe as a course as well, for your worksite.
Awesome. If anyone else does have any further questions, feel free to send them through to our main email address, which is info@chemsafety.co.nz, and we can get back to you there. But that looks like we're all done here. Chrissy will send you through an email following this, which will have the recording if you needed to listen to any of this again.
And also links to our YouTube channel with the other recordings as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your questions today. It really helps to have good questions to answer, and when we set out on these sorts of things, we're not quite sure what we're going to get. So it's really interesting to see the direction that your questions are.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. See you later.